So, today's topic is patience, and we get that from the book of Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind. So first of all, we ask ourselves, what is patience? And I think the best way to demonstrate patience is through a picture. And here is the Wikipedia definition. Patience is the state of endurance under difficult circumstances, which can mean persevering in the face of delay or provocation without acting on negative annoyance, anger, or exhibiting forbearance when under strain, especially when faced with longer-term difficulties. Patience is the level of endurance one can take before negativity. It is also used to refer to the character trait of being steadfast. So, in that last definition, patience is the level of endurance one can take before negativity. I thought that was kind of interesting because everyone eventually has a limit. And at the end of the limit, if you still have to wait, you're waiting, but you're not being patient. And so being patient is almost like a foundational virtue. But it can also be described as an attitude. Whereas being kind, the second part of that quote from St. Paul, that is an action. So being patient, an attitude, being kind, an action. But the fact that patience goes first in that sentence suggests that it's a foundational virtue. In other words, it's a virtue that everything else is built up on. If you don't have patience, then you really don't have a foundation to build upon in terms of your spiritual and emotional life. So patience and having patience is a sign of spiritual maturity. Well spoken, Yoda. Thank you. So how do I develop patience, knowing how fundamentally valuable it is for us all to have patience? The answer is, I cooperate with God. So God provides the circumstances, and we provide the response. So I was once told, you don't really want to pray for patience. Why? Can anyone answer that question? Why don't you want to pray for patience? Well, it's similar to a friend of mine called me last week and said, what's the topic on your Sunday sermon? And I said, patience. And he said, oh boy. God is going to teach you you're going to go through lots of struggles this week, I'm afraid. And he was right. So God has been teaching me the virtue of patience this last couple of weeks. I was scheduled to give this talk last Sunday, but I got rescued by a Ukrainian gentleman. So I had a 1-week reprieve to go through another round of patience-building activity. So anyway, we cooperate with God to build patience. God provides the circumstances, and then we are in charge of our response. Here's one guy. This is how he handles it. So our response, depending on our response, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they are good for us. This is the very positive, upbeat attitude from St. Paul. And if you've studied anything about St. Paul, you know what a rough life he had. Thrown into jail, shipwrecked, and beaten up by crowds, and escaped, by the skin of his teeth many times. And his response to all that is, we can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they are good for us. They help us learn to be patient, and patience develops strength of character in us and helps us trust God more each time we use it, until finally our hope and faith are strong and steady. So what should our attitude be? Thank God for our problems. Are we any good at that? That's obviously something we all need to practice, isn't it? So, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. So, in other words, St. Paul is explaining that this attitude is something that you have to choose. You have to clothe yourself in it. You know, you don't just walk into your closet every morning and the clothes jump onto you. You have to go in there and choose the clothes that you're going to put on yourself. And that's exactly why Paul chose this particular analogy. So you have to make that choice, a conscious decision to be patient. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. That was Solomon. Proverbs. It's the same type of idea. You're choosing your response. You're binding these virtues onto yourself. There was an experiment done in the 1960s by a Stanford professor, Walter Mischel, and it was famously known as the marshmallow test. Some of you may have heard about it. It was an experiment done on 4-year-olds, and basically he would invite them into a room, sit them down on a table, on a chair, in front of a table, and on the table was a plate, and in the plate was a nice plump marshmallow. And then he would tell the child, if you can wait 15 minutes or a short time, then without eating this marshmallow, then I'll give you 2 marshmallows. Okay? But if you eat it, I'm not going to give you any more marshmallows. And then he would leave the room. And then it was interesting to see the children's reaction. Many of them would just eat it right away. Some of them would just, sit on their hands and bang their head on the table and then eat it. Others would walk around the room and then eat it. Only 30% of the children were able to be patient enough to wait for him to come back into the room and get the second marshmallow. So at the time he thought it was a fairly interesting experiment, but he didn't think much of it, and then moved on to do other experiments in his life. 15 to 20 years later, he did a follow-up experiment, or he did a follow-up study to see how those children were all doing. And to his surprise, actually, this is where the interesting part of the experiment really comes into play, he found that the children who waited had, interestingly enough, what do you think, a better outcome in their life? Yeah. So he judged better outcome in several ways: SAT scores, educational attainment, body mass index, income, healthier relationships, all that stuff. He basically found there was a very powerful correlation between people or kids who had learned to be patient and those who did well in life. So being patient is a virtue, and there's other ways we can develop it. One is to discover a bigger perspective. So a man's wisdom gives him patience. Solomon should know, considered to be the wisest man who ever lived. A man's wisdom gives him patience. If you have a broader mind, if you have a big mind, it's easier for you to absorb a negative situation or a negative person. So that's what he's talking about. Get a bigger perspective is one way to develop your patience. Read books, study spiritual material that helps you grow your mind. Secondly, deepen your love. Fill yourself with love. Love is a patience builder. In other words, here's an analogy. Say you have a coffee cup full of coffee and you're walking through a crowd and somebody jolts you a little bit, then what comes out of the coffee cup is coffee. Okay? I mean, it's obvious, right? If you have anger inside of you and you get jostled a little bit, then anger comes out. That's immediately the response. If you're full of anger and somebody accuses you of something, your instant response is the kick back, punch back, defend yourself vigorously, maybe a little bit over the top. But if you fill your heart with love, then what comes out in that situation is love, and therefore patience. So filling yourself with love and developing a loving, heartistic attitude, looking at the world, looking at your situation from God's point of view, having that kind of perspective is going to be very helpful in developing your patience. And thirdly, depend on God's power. We can't do this on our own power. If you remember, we had this talk a while ago where we talked about the lamp being plugged into the wall. The lamp can't generate its own power, but when it's plugged into the wall, it can last thousands of hours. So in the same way, when we are plugged into God, we have an unlimited source of potential power that we can exert. May He strengthen you in His glorious might with ample power to meet whatever comes with fortitude, patience, and joy. Again, spoken by someone who really knew what he was talking about. St. Paul again in his letter to the Colossians. So, impatience, when you're impatient with somebody, it says more about you than it does about the person you're being impatient with. It says more about your state of mind in that moment than it does about the surrounding situation that you're in. In fact, if you were to tell other people, in fact, you probably wouldn't want to tell other people. Like, when I'm driving a car, for some reason, I get very impatient. And that gives me a kind of gauge as to where I'm at in my spiritual life. And that's not something I'm proudly going to relate to my wife when I get back home. How was your day, honey? Oh, yeah, I flipped off this driver on the freeway, and then there was this other guy, I shouted at him, and, you know, all these other experiences or examples of you losing your patience and exhibiting really antisocial behaviors is not something that you're going to be very proud of or want to relate or make a film or a song or a dance about. But if you can develop patience, then it's definitely something that you can be proud of. So, impatience, again, says more about you than it does about your environment. Peace be unto thy soul. Thine adversity and thine afflictions shall be but a small moment. And then, if thou endure it well, God shall exalt thee on high. So, does anyone know who said that? That was Joseph Smith, founder of the Latter-day Saints. And he was in jail when he had that revelation. Ironically enough, he was in jail in Missouri in a town called Liberty. So the irony is not lost. So patience, therefore, is a form of action. Okay, this is Auguste Rodin. He was the famous sculptor. Patience is not the ability to wait, but how you act while you are waiting. So let us be patient. Let us be patient. Patience is a human responsibility, just to recap. It's not something that we're born with. It's not something you inherit. It's something that you need to work on. It takes effort. It takes time. It takes energy for you to develop patience. Patience is an active choice. Patience, it requires time, energy, and effort. Patience, therefore, is the ability to put our desires on hold for a time. It's a precious and rare virtue. We want what we want, and we want it now. So said Dieter Uchtdorf. And I like his other quote, which is, what is the opposite of patience? Impatience. What is impatience? If patience is this solid virtue that is a foundational virtue of our life, impatience does the opposite, and it's the opposite of spiritual maturity. Impatience is a symptom of selfishness. It is a trait of the self-absorbed. It arises from the all too prevalent condition called center of the universe syndrome. Have you met people who suffer from this center of the universe syndrome? Well, babies are suffering from this. But we expect that because we expect that babies are immature. But unfortunately, maturity is a human choice condition. So while your body gets older, and there's not much you can do about that, sorry, your spirit and your emotional maturity is very much in your hands. I mean, it's like a tree can't be anything but a tree. A human being, however, does have the choice to say no to growth. Right? I mean, have you met any elder people who behave like children? Well, there you go. Okay? Not fully human yet. So impatience is a symptom of this selfishness. It's a suffering. There's no known cure for this center of the universe syndrome except by developing patience, which leads people to believe that the world revolves around them and that all others are just supporting cast in the grand theater of mortality in which only they have the starring role. So you met people like that in the traffic jam, in the shopping lines, in any kind of line. It's all about me. So patience is not passive resignation, nor is it failing to act because of our fears. Patience means active waiting and enduring. It means staying with something and doing all that we can, working, hoping, and exercising faith, bearing hardship with fortitude, even when the desires of our hearts are delayed. Patience is not simply enduring, it is enduring well. It's important to remember that masterpieces were not created overnight. It is important to remember that God had the Israelites wait in the desert for 80 years. It is important to remember that any great accomplishment took time. It took a great amount of time for it to be accomplished. It's important to remember that there was a growing period when God created the universe. It's important to remember that you don't reach maturity overnight either. So be patient with yourself. Be patient with other people. There's that bumper sticker that says, "Be patient with me. God's not done with me yet." And imagine that. If God were to say, "Oh, you know what? I give up on you." That would be terrible. But God doesn't do that. God always allows for U-turns, to use another car analogy. God is never going to give up on us. God is patiently waiting for us to mature. And unfortunately, God gives us these same lessons over and over again. Have any of you been in a teaching position where you've had to give lessons to students and you just wonder why they didn't learn the lesson, why they keep repeating the same mistakes, and you have to punish them again and again and again and again and again and again? And you just feel pain, you know, as a parent, as a teacher, you just feel like, why can't this child understand that this is not acceptable behavior, or this is not an acceptable response? Why can't they just learn the correct response and move on to the next lesson? Why are they stuck on lesson 1 after all these years? I don't get it. It's very frustrating, but imagine God's frustration. Imagine God's frustration. In fact, if you imagine God's frustration, I think that's going to help you a lot in your life, because you're going to be thinking, if you're thinking on that cosmic level, and you look at your life and your problems, you go, they're nothing. Oh my gosh, restoration of human race, that's a huge problem. You know what? I can wait 5 more minutes in this line. Yep. So, I remember reading this other philosopher who explained that when you're in a position when you're waiting, it gives you an opportunity to reflect on your life. And often we don't get those, or we don't give ourselves those opportunities in this fast world where everything's boom, 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 we've got to get everything done quickly, and text messages and instant this and instant that, and fast food and fast cars and fast. And then, when you're stuck in the traffic jam, it's almost like you're forced to contemplate. So turn off your radio, turn off your CD player, and enjoy the moment. Try it. I mean, you're not going anywhere physically, so you're either going to be sitting there gripping the steering wheel and getting more and more resentful, or you can just relax and think, okay, where am I going in life? What do I want to accomplish? What have I accomplished so far? Etc., etc., etc. So it's a great opportunity to slow down and think before you make your next move. And so I just wanted to finish off with a quote from our founder, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. Persevering and overcoming means you must patiently endure. No one likes to patiently endure. However, we must do so, even if it requires unbelievable effort. For those of you who have read the founder's autobiography, you'll know that when he was a young boy, he was extremely impatient. He would run back from school, he would sit down expecting to be fed immediately by his mother, and if the food didn't show up within a minute, he was off, because, he's had no patience. So patience is something that obviously he developed, and if you want to study his life, I encourage you to do so. It's an extraordinary life, and you can see that he really was able to overcome that initial immature response to situations by becoming an incredibly patient person. But it was always an impulse to be impatient. So persevering and overcoming means you must patiently endure. No one likes to patiently endure. However, we must do so even if it requires unbelievable effort. Satan is helpless in front of such people, in front of those who persevere. And in the end, he will surrender to them. So be patient and endure until the very end. It is for this reason that God, our Father, has endured everything for 6,000 years. We have inherited his heavenly character, so we must become like him. Therefore, our philosophy of life in this fallen world has been to be one of patience and endurance. Who is this for? It is for God. The ways of filial piety and loyalty start from this. It is where the movement to liberate the nation and the world begins. That liberated world will be a place that both the good world and the bad world will welcome, and therefore hell will disappear. That is why, under this principle, we must be patient and endure. Please join me in prayer. Our Heavenly Parents, thank you so much for this opportunity to be reminded of this virtue, this foundational virtue that we are all struggling to develop in our lives. Help us to understand your perspective. Help us to understand your love for each and every one of us. Help us to have that healthy state of mind so that we can more easily be patient in situations that challenge us. So we thank you once again for this reminder, and we pray that we can go forth throughout the rest of this day and this coming week and exercise patience in those situations where we are being asked to do so, mostly by you, so that you can watch us grow, help us to develop our full potential as human beings. We thank you, and we offer this prayer through Christ our Lord, our Jew, and Amen.